What if the most powerful military in human history just lost a war it already won? Stay with me, because the answer is sitting in a deal signed this week, and it should terrify anyone who thought this was over. Before I show you what happened, hit that like button right now. Not because I asked nicely, because the algorithm only shows this video to people who haven't seen it yet, and if you don't tell it you're interested in the next 60 seconds, you'll never finish this video, and you'll never know how this story ends. So tap like, hit subscribe, and send this to one person who still thinks this war is finished. Let's go. Here's what just happened in plain terms. The United States and Israel launched a massive military operation against Iran earlier this year. The goal was simple on paper: destroy Iran's nuclear program, cripple its missile capability, and end the threat for good. It was fast, it was loud, and for a few days it looked decisive. Then the war didn't end. It dragged on. Iran shut down the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow stretch of water that carries roughly a fifth of the world's oil and gas every single day. Oil prices spiked, shipping companies froze in place, and the United States found itself stuck fighting on more fronts than it could comfortably afford. This week, in a luxury hotel in Switzerland, the United States and Iran signed a memorandum of understanding, mediated by Pakistan and Qatar. Headlines called it a breakthrough, a 60-day roadmap toward a final deal, Strait of Hormuz reopening, some sanctions paused, frozen funds possibly released depending on compliance, IAEA inspectors invited back in. Sounds like progress, right? Maybe even a win. I want you to slow down and ask one question before you accept that headline. Who actually walked away stronger from that room? Because here's the thing about wars that end in paperwork instead of surrender. The paperwork tells you who really won, if you know how to read it. And once you read this one carefully, a very old, very uncomfortable historical pattern starts to surface. Let's go back about 2,400 years. In ancient Greece, a historian named Thucydides wrote about a city that thought it could not lose. That city was Athens. At the time, Athens had the strongest navy in the known world, the richest treasury, and a political system everyone else admired. Athens was already locked in a long, grinding war against its rival Sparta. It was already stretched thin, already spending resources it didn't have to spare. And then Athens made a choice. Instead of consolidating, instead of finishing the war it was already fighting, Athens decided to open a second front. It sent its best ships, its best soldiers, and its best generals across the sea to conquer the island of Sicily. Why? Not because Athens desperately needed Sicily, because Athens believed it could have it. Because powerful nations sometimes stop asking, should we, and only ask, can we? The expedition failed completely. The fleet was destroyed, the army was wiped out, and Athens never recovered the strength it had before that decision. Within a decade, Athens lost the entire war to Sparta. Not because Sparta suddenly became stronger, because Athens broke itself first, reaching for more than it could actually hold. Historians have a phrase for the psychological cycle that produces this kind of self-destruction. It starts with overconfidence so extreme that a nation stops believing normal limits apply to it. That overconfidence creates a kind of blindness where warning signs get ignored and risk gets wildly underestimated. Then reality sends its correction, not through an enemy's cleverness, but through plain facts on the ground. Geography, logistics, economics, allies who quietly walk away. And finally comes the reckoning, when the bill for all of it arrives at once. I'm not telling you this story for a history lesson. I'm telling you because I think we are watching a modern version of it happen in real time, and almost nobody is naming it out loud. Let's look at the modern version, piece by piece. The operation against Iran was designed to be fast and overwhelming. Reports describe it as an attempt to cripple Iran's nuclear and missile capability in a tight window, almost like a knockout punch. That's not a criticism of the soldiers who carried it out. It's a description of the mindset behind the planning. Total confidence that overwhelming force would settle the matter quickly and cleanly. But Iran is a country of around 90 million people, with a government that has spent decades preparing for exactly this kind of confrontation. A knockout punch against a country like that doesn't usually land the way planners hope. And it didn't. Instead, the United States found itself managing not one conflict, but several overlapping pressures at the same time. There was the direct fight with Iran. There was an ongoing economic and technology standoff with China, including export controls on advanced computer chips that Washington has poured enormous resources into enforcing. And there was the continuing effort to support Ukraine against Russia, trying to prevent Moscow from claiming a full victory there. 3 different pressure points. One country. Limited money, limited weapons stockpiles, limited patience back home. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's just arithmetic. And arithmetic doesn't care how powerful your military looks on paper. Here's where it gets specific. During this stretch, U.S. officials acknowledged pausing a major weapons sale to Taiwan, a close strategic partner, because military stockpiles were being prioritized elsewhere. Think about what that actually means. A nation with the largest defense budget on the planet had to tell one of its most important allies, "Not right now, we're short." That's not weakness whispered in private. That's weakness stated out loud in public by an official. That's the blindness stage, not stupidity, blindness. The inability to see in advance that committing to everything everywhere eventually means failing to fully deliver anywhere. Now let's talk about where the real correction came from, because it didn't come from a clever enemy maneuver, it came from geography. The Strait of Hormuz is only about 20 miles wide at its narrowest point. Through that narrow gap flows roughly a fifth of the entire world's oil and gas supply, every single day. Japan depends on it, South Korea depends on it, Germany depends on it, India and China depend on it. When Iran moved to restrict and threaten shipping through that strait, it didn't need to defeat the US Navy in open battle. It just needed to make global energy markets nervous enough to panic, and panic they did. Oil prices spiked. Shipping companies rerouted or paused entirely. The global economy started absorbing real damage, the kind that shows up in gas prices and grocery bills for ordinary people who have never heard of the Strait of Hormuz. You can have the most powerful navy in human history and still not be able to simply force open a strait that a determined adversary is actively contesting, especially when that adversary is willing to absorb retaliation and keep going. Overwhelming force doesn't always translate into control. Sometimes the weaker side just needs to make the cost of control too painful to sustain. This is the part where I want to pause and give credit to the other side of the argument, because a fair analysis has to do that. There's a real case that ending the active fighting, even on imperfect terms, was the right move. Oil above $100 a barrel for a sustained period threatens to drag the entire global economy toward recession. Every additional week of a closed or contested strait means billions of dollars in disrupted trade. From that angle, stopping the bleeding through diplomacy isn't weakness, it's responsible crisis management. A messy peace can beat an open-ended war, especially one being fought on multiple fronts at once. There's also something genuinely new in this agreement, a direct communication channel between American and Iranian officials, specifically designed to prevent small incidents from spiraling into bigger ones. That kind of structure didn't really exist before, and in a region this volatile, a working hotline is not nothing. So no, this isn't a simple story of fools making an obviously bad deal. Reasonable, experienced people can look at the battlefield reality and conclude this was the least damaging path available. I want to be honest about that, because the strongest version of an argument deserves to be heard before you decide whether you agree with it. But here's what that argument has to explain away, and so far, it hasn't. Like, subscribe, share, and now do this one thing for me. Drop a comment with the year you think this gets fully resolved. I read every guess. Let's talk about the deal itself, because the structure tells a story all on its own. In a traditional arms control negotiation, the normal order of operations is simple. Verify first, then reward. The side with the weapons program proves it's complying, inspectors confirm it, and only then does meaningful relief follow. That was the basic logic behind the 2015 nuclear agreement with Iran. Dismantle first, open the doors to inspectors first, reduce stockpiles first. Sanctions relief came only after proof. This new framework runs in something closer to the opposite direction. Iran gets meaningful, immediate steps. A partial reopening of trade through the strait, a temporary license allowing Iranian oil exports for a defined window, the door open to invite international inspectors back in. Some of these things are happening right away, while the hardest question of all, the actual future of Iran's nuclear program, is pushed into a 60-day negotiating window that hasn't even started yet. Now, to be fair and accurate, U.S. officials have publicly pushed back hard on the claim that billions of dollars in frozen funds are simply being handed over with no strings attached. One senior official said directly that the United States isn't giving up a single cent to Iran as part of this. Other reporting describes any future unfreezing of assets as something that would happen only under a controlled process designed to make sure money reaches ordinary Iranians rather than funding militant groups, and only as compliance unfolds. So this isn't a blank check. It's not, here's $300 billion, good luck. That figure has been specifically and publicly denied by the highest levels of the administration. I want to be precise here, because exaggerating a claim doesn't make the real story weaker. It makes it easier to dismiss. The real story doesn't need an inflated number to be unsettling. Here's the actual sequencing problem. The easing of pressure starts now. The actual nuclear conversation, the entire reason this war began in the first place, starts later, inside a 60-day window that has barely begun, with the hardest and most contentious issue still completely unresolved. Whoever controls the order in which promises get fulfilled holds real leverage. If you act first, and the other side can simply wait and watch before reciprocating, you've handed them the ability to evaluate, stall, and adjust at their own pace. That's not paranoia. That's just how sequencing works in any negotiation, whether it's a peace treaty or a business deal. And there's a second pressure point sitting quietly inside the numbers. Iran is currently reported to be holding a significant stockpile of uranium enriched to a level approaching weapons grade. That material has not yet been verified as diluted or moved under full international oversight. It exists right now inside Iranian territory. The question of exactly when and how that gets resolved is one of the central things this 60-day window is supposed to settle. That single unresolved fact should be the headline of this story. Instead, it's buried under feel-good language about roadmaps and breakthroughs. Now, here's the part that almost nobody is connecting properly, and it's maybe the most important detail in the entire situation. While negotiators were in that room in Switzerland working through the night trying to hold this fragile framework together, the President of the United States posted public threats on social media, at one point warning of severe consequences if Iran moved against the strait, language graphic enough that it could be read as a threat directed at Iran's own negotiators. This happened while his own delegation was actively negotiating in the same building. Think about what that does to a negotiation. You can have your most skilled diplomats in the room making careful progress, building trust inch by inch, and then watch all of it get shaken by a single public post from outside the room. Reports indicate this exact dynamic created real strain and contributed to a rocky, disrupted start to the talks. This matters more than almost anything else in this story because it reveals something structural. It's not that American diplomats are incompetent, far from it. It's that the negotiating team and the political leadership above them are not always moving in the same direction at the same time. And when that happens, the other side notices immediately. Every public threat becomes something the other side can point to and say, look, they're not coordinated, we can use this, that's not a one-time slip. Based on what's already happened once, it's a pattern that's likely to repeat throughout this entire 60-day window. Every time it happens, it hands the other side a fresh public justification to slow down, demand more clarity, or claim the conditions of good faith have been disrupted. Let's zoom out now and look at who else is shaping this outcome, because the story is bigger than just two countries in a room. For decades, the United States positioned itself as the central broker of nearly every major Middle East negotiation. This time, the actual framework, the joint statements, the language of encouraging progress came from Pakistan and Qatar. Iran's negotiating team has been responding primarily to messages from those two mediators, not directly and publicly to Washington's social media statements. That's a meaningful shift in who is actually steering the diplomatic process on the ground. Meanwhile, traditional regional partners in the Gulf were notably reluctant to offer their territory or airspace for direct military operations against Iran. Their caution reflects a very rational calculation. Getting too closely associated with one side in an active conflict makes you a potential target too. Alliance loyalty has limits when your own security is on the line. And on the economic side, Iran's oil continued finding buyers throughout this conflict, regardless of sanctions pressure, while other major powers provided diplomatic cover at international forums, slowing or blocking unified pressure campaigns. None of that requires anyone to fire a shot. It just requires patience and a willingness to let someone else absorb the cost of staying in a fight. This is the part of the Athens story that gets overlooked the most. Athens didn't lose because Sparta suddenly became unbeatable. Athens lost because everyone around the conflict, allies, rivals, and outside powers, made their own calculations and slowly stopped behaving the way Athens assumed they would. The world doesn't usually deliver your downfall in one dramatic blow. It usually just stops cooperating with the story you've been telling yourself. So where does that leave things right now today? The honest answer is nobody fully knows yet, and that uncertainty is exactly the point. This is not, and I want to be very clear about this, a finished story with a clean ending. The framework signed this week is explicitly described, even by the people who negotiated it, as a starting point rather than a finish line. The hottest topic, Iran's nuclear program, hasn't actually been negotiated yet. It's been scheduled. There are real fragile points worth watching closely in the days ahead. The situation in Lebanon remains tense, with continued military activity creating risk that any serious escalation there could be treated as a violation that unravels the broader framework before nuclear talks even properly begin. Technical teams are set to continue working through specific implementation details this week, and how flexible or rigid those conversations turn out to be will tell us a lot about whether each side is negotiating in good faith or simply running out the clock while enjoying the benefits already on the table. And based on what's already happened once, the gap between calm, careful diplomacy inside the room and unpredictable public statements outside it is likely to remain the single biggest wildcard in whether this entire framework survives the full 60 days. None of this means collapse is guaranteed. It also doesn't mean success is guaranteed. It means the situation is genuinely unresolved, and anyone telling you with total confidence exactly how this ends in 2 months is guessing, not reporting. What we can say with confidence is this: the country that launched a major operation explicitly designed to end Iran's nuclear ambitions for good is now, months later, sitting across a table, negotiating the terms under which that exact same nuclear question will be discussed later. Some of its diplomatic leverage was clearly used up in the process. Some of its traditional control over Middle East diplomacy visibly shifted toward new mediators, and the gap between its negotiators and its own leadership's public statements became, for at least one tense moment, a genuine threat to the talks themselves. That's not the outcome a knockout operation was supposed to produce. And it's worth sitting with that gap honestly, instead of rushing to call it either total victory or total defeat. I want to be honest with you about something else before we close this out. I'm not a former official. I don't have classified information. I'm someone who reads carefully, checks sources, and tries to apply a consistent way of thinking to what's actually happening, instead of just repeating whichever headline sounds most dramatic. So don't take my framing as the final word. Go read the actual joint statements yourself. Compare how each side describes what was agreed. You'll often find the gaps between those descriptions tell you more than either side's spin does. And if you want to go deeper into the history behind all of this, read about Athens and the Sicilian expedition for yourself. It's one of the most studied cautionary tales in the history of military strategy, and reading the original account, rather than someone else's summary of it, will change how you watch every modern conflict from now on. Here is the question I want you to sit with, because I genuinely don't have a clean, comfortable answer for it. A narrow stretch of water, barely 20 miles across, helped force the most expensive, most advanced military machine in human history to pause its goals, adjust its position, and sit down at a table on terms it didn't fully control. Not because of a single battlefield defeat, because of geography, exhaustion, sequencing, and a few public posts that landed at exactly the wrong moment. Power can buy you the ability to start almost anything. It cannot buy you control over how the story ends. Athens learned that lesson at the cost of an empire. The next 60 days will tell us whether anyone in Washington has actually learned it too, or whether the loudest voice in the room is still the one steering the ship straight toward the rocks. If this kind of clear-eyed breakdown is what you came here for, subscribe now, because the next 60 days are going to produce a lot of noise and very little real clarity, and that's exactly the gap this channel exists to fill. I'll see you in the next one.